All right. Kind of dark in here, but I'll try to do this anyway. So today I want to talk about Canada being more collectivist than America. America's more individualist, and that's total bunk. Prior to the 1960s, Canada really didn't have a national culture. Even today, it's up in the air. We defined ourselves mainly through our political institutions. So we were a federal nation. We had a parliamentary form of government, and there wasn't much patriotism in Canada. And then, after World War II, cultural Marxism became all the fad. And I don't mean that term in like a conspiratorial sense. It's just that the idea that emerged in the universities and, intellectuals really grasped onto was undeniably socialist culturally. And maybe it's because our political institutions had already moved towards socialism, or maybe it's because we were already, for some reason becoming more socialist. I guess it's kind of the chicken and the egg thing. So the first guy that really emphasized this, America as individualist and Canada as collectivist, was Seymour Martin Lipset. He was an American sociologist, and he popularized this idea with his book, The First New Nation. He compared Americans and Canadians using pattern variables. Now, anyone familiar with praxeology or economics, or even a little bit of libertarianism, will know that this kind of categorization of human action is just utterly unscientific. There are no constants in human action. You can't measure people like you would do to things in the natural world. And really, aside from some cultural differences and accents, there's really no fundamental reason why Americans would be more individualist than Canadians. So, personally, I've traveled both the U.S. and Canada, and I've met a bunch of people from different walks of life, and yet I can tell you firsthand that there are Americans that are left wing nuts who could also be apologists for communist murderers, and you get that in both Canada and the U.S. There's no reason why Canadians would be less individualist. Like, we're all just individuals, and we're living, borders are just arbitrary lines. So Anyway, now that said, I do find Americans to be more entrepreneurial than Canadians, and a lot of Canadians do tend to trust the government and rely on it. But we've also had this cultural Marxist notion that Canada is more socialist, drilled into our brains since the 1960s. So this is a multi-generational problem. Anyway, Lipset, the sociologist, the field of science that is total bunk, Lipset expanded his thesis that Canadians were less liberal in the classical Lockean sense. The Canadians were less liberal than the Americans. And he furthered this with publications such as Revolution and Counter-Revolution, Canada and the United States, and a book called Continental Divide. Now, Lipset influenced Gad Horowitz. He's a political science professor at University of Toronto. Hopefully I'm not butchering his name. So you can see how this idea would really catch on among Marxian academics. It's really, it's a godsend. They get to tell Canadians who they are based on sociology. So Horowitz wrote this influential piece called Conservatism, Liberalism, and Socialism in Canada, an Interpretation, in the Canadian Journal of Economics and Political Science in 1966. And, this is, the article. Horowitz, of course, been influenced by Marx, didn't rely on sociology, but rather the left-right paradigm. But, he also picked up on this Marxian notion that, history is a set of stages that we move through. There's this law of history that we all succumb to. And it's inevitably moving towards communism. So the fact that Canadians are a lot less classically liberal than the Americans and we're more socialist, it means that we're further down the road to, progress. And you can really see how this idea developed that Canadians are more advanced or better than Americans. Because, we care about community and universal health care and, all that bullshit. So Horowitz adapted this thesis, also from Lewis Hartz, who also took the view that Canada was more collectivist than America. And, this is something that is ingrained into, the brains of the people. for some reason, being born north of the 49th makes me more collectivist. Whatever. So the publication of this Horowitz's article, whole industry was born, as H.D. Forbes puts it. He's also a professor of UT. Any overview of Canadian political thought or political culture must reckon with Horowitz's adaptation of Hearts. So there you have it. That was a quote. There you have it. In the 1960s, and even to this day, if you want to get published in a journal of political science or economics, you essentially need to conform to this notion that Canada is more collectivist than America. And you see this in standard textbooks, the roots of disunity, political parties and ideologies in Canada, these major two works. But the third work, and this is probably the most famous one, is amplified this notion and really made it mainstream. And of course, I'm referring to George Grant's Laminate for a Nation. Now, Grant gives us reasons why we should not be classically liberal. He's not a fan of free market capitalism. And, well, of course, the rest is history. Laminate for a Nation is still required reading in most political science courses and in philosophy. Laminate for a Nation, I think, was just republished recently, so you can walk in any bookstore in Canada. I'm sure you can find it. And, Grant has been, now cast under the Canadian idealist tradition, which is really just the philosophical underpinnings of the NDP. Although Grant, when he was alive, was more of a Tory, which is still socialist. And I know that might seem like an oxymoron for a lot of people. But if you think it through, Tories tend to be more about family traditions and social conservatism. And, they're not libertarian. They're not really for individual liberty or property rights. Social tradition trumps all that because they're Tories, traditionals. You can see where that would be more collectivist. Weird, isn't it? The NDP and Tories would actually have more in common. So basically, this is where the idea comes from. That the idea that Canada is more collectivist than America. It's a relatively new idea. It started in the 60s, but it really influences Canadian history as well. Most histories of Canada's origins and of Confederation have now been warped by this ideology, which is not true. When you go back, there's a book called Canada's Founding Debates, or another one called Canada's Origins. Peter Smith is a good historian. Same with Janet. Now, this I'm definitely going to butcher her name. Janet Agenstadt. I got to look that up. It's AJZENSTAT. Right? Yeah. Anyway, she's great. She's got a book called John Locke and Parliament, Canadian Founding. So this kind of revisionist history, it's not really revisionist. It's actual history. It's a history that Canada, the Canadian founders, although a lot of them, they were crony capitalists, or they were tied to crony capitalists. A confederation wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for a bunch of railroad financiers. But that said, liberty and freedom in the 1860s and before and after was about what we now call negative freedom. It was just freedom from arbitrary aggression, freedom of individual liberty, private property. And in the 1960s, that's the real revisionist history there, kind of reactionary, counter-Enlightenment ideas, and they completely just they see John A. Macdonald as a Tory, so they paint these Tory brushstrokes, and it's kind of perverted the whole history of Canada. We were born, or Canada's origins. Well, I'll give you a great example. The Loyalists, who were loyal to the British Crown and came up after the American Revolution or during the American Revolution, they founded Ontario. They founded New Brunswick. They made Nova Scotia even bigger. These the Loyalists, they're really they were kind of libertarian. The liberty back then was liberty as how libertarians see it now. And this notion that liberty and freedom is actually, the freedom to goods and services, freedom to healthcare, freedom to education. That's a Marxist idea, and it originated in the 1960s, and it has nothing to do with what people believed in the past. especially, the founders. As corrupt as they may have been, they knew what liberty was all about. And you got to remember the reason Canada was more centralized than the U.S. because Confederation at the time, Confederation happened during the American Civil War, which they saw as a breakdown of that, too much democracy. It was, the succession. It was a problem. The solution, in the 1860s, the idea, the classical liberal solution to too much unbridled democracy was a centralized government. So you saw that in Canada, you saw that in Germany, and a couple hundred years later, 150 years later, we now see that that's been a massive failure, and now we know the origins of the Civil War were less about unbridled democracy and more just about the right to succeed. So anyway, I just want to get into that. I guess that's all I want to say about that. So subscribe if you haven't already. My third video. I'm probably going to keep making more. And sorry about the lighting in here. The lighting kind of sucks. Oh, that doesn't make it better. All right. Bye.